Welcome, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Donahue, the Assistant Dean for Public and External Affairs. Welcome to one of our 4:30 talks. There is an e-newsletter sign-up for our 4:30 talks going around the room, so if you're not on it, please do sign up, and then you'll be able to hear about all our talks. And there's a public reception following this talk afterwards, so please join us for that. So today's talk is titled Racial Dimensions of the Foreclosure Crisis. It is the second in a series of lectures in the school's Race and Public Policy series. And our speaker is Doug Massey, the Henry G. Bryant Professor of Sociology and Public Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School, and effective July 1st, 2001, the new director of our Office of Population Research. He also has a lot of other affiliations, which are very important, but we're going to make this a short introduction. His research focuses on international migration, race and housing, discrimination, education, urban poverty, and Latin America. And his most recent article, Racial Segregation and the American Foreclosure Crisis, which he wrote with one of our PhD students, who I think is here, is the basis for today's talk. And so I've handed out a summary of the paper, but if you'd like the longer paper, it's on the Woodrow Wilson School website. So please help me introduce Doug Massey.
Supposed to come up. PowerPoint?
Did you load it?
He loaded it, and it was on there. But what's with him? He's coming. What happened? It appears the bulb has burnt out.
Oh no.
I'm going to tell you once we get PowerPoint working. The United States continues to be a very segregated place on the basis of race and increasingly on the basis of class. Racial segregation is a phenomenon long standing in the United States, going back to the late 19th and early 20th century. If you look at the position of African Americans in cities at the end of the Civil War, levels of segregation were not exceptionally high. And levels of segregation of African Americans looked about the same as the degree of segregation experienced by Germans, immigrants, and Irish immigrants at about the same time. After the Civil War, of course, there was a massive demographic transformation of the United States through mass migration. Mass immigration from Europe, which has increasingly shifted from the north and the west of Europe to the south and the east of Europe. And a little bit later on, a mass migration from the rural south into cities throughout the United States, but especially the north and the west. As black populations rose in the northern cities, and as southern and eastern European populations rose in northern cities during the industrial era, segregation levels rose. And they rose quite dramatically, partly because of the industrial transformation of urban spatial structure itself, and also because of prejudicial actions taken against Southern European Catholics, Eastern European Jews, in the early part of the 20th century. However, levels of segregation for Italians, Russian Jews, Poles, although they rose substantially above what had been experienced in the pre-industrial city by Irish and Germans, they never reached the heights that characterize African American segregation. So the typical measure of segregation is something called the index of dissimilarity, which varies from 0 to 1, or 0 to 100. And And on this scale, Irish and German immigration segregation was about 30, 40, or 50 in that range in the mid-1800s. By the late 1800s, during the height of the immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, and Jews had achieved levels in the 50 to 60 range. But very few cities experienced a level above 60. In contrast, African Americans rose from levels of 30, 40, or 50 in the mid-19th century, and by the 1920s had achieved levels that were universally 70, 80, 90, or even pushing 100. A very high level of segregation. This is the current circumstances, at least according to the year 2000 census. We'll soon as the 2010 census and the American Community Survey for 2010 become available, we'll have more updated information. But as of 2010, among all African Americans living in cities in the United States, about half lived under conditions of hypersegregation, which is a very intense level of segregation characterized by high levels of segregation across 5 separate geographic dimensions simultaneously. They're unevenly distributed. Most African Americans live in neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly black. These are clustered tightly together in space to form a compact ghetto. They're a high density, and they tend to be centralized towards the center of the metropolitan area. So half of all blacks in the United States, urban blacks, live in hypersegregated, and another 21% live in cities, in metropolitan areas with a high level of segregation, above 60. And only a small minority, about 30%, less than a third, live under low to moderate, mostly moderate levels of segregation. What we have here are trends. In some of the nation's most segregated cities, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, Newark, and Philadelphia, see from 80 to 90 to 2000, they stayed high, and there was very little downward trend. The idea that there's been, that we've moved into a race-blind society when it comes to residential patterns certainly is not the case. Of course, we're not a black-white society anymore. We're becoming increasingly diverse with, in the latter part of the 20th century, in the first decade of the 21st century, resumption of mass immigration after a long hiatus that lasted from 1929 to about 1969. 1970, the United States actually reaches the lowest level of foreign-born, the lowest percentage foreign-born ever in its history, before or since. And now we're actually back up to percentage foreign-born that's more in line with historical trends before the great hiatus in the mid-20th century. So what we have here are the levels of dissimilarity. Anti-blacks are still quite high, and what we see is a slow decline. And it's still in the high range, above 60. This is the average of all metropolitan areas in the United States. I'll talk a little bit about why this curve goes down a little bit more than the ones I showed you with the hypersegregated areas before. This is Hispanic white segregation, and when I use the term white, it's not Hispanic whites, henceforth, and Asian white segregation. So Asian segregation is very moderate, much like we observed for Irish and Germans in the mid-19th century. Hispanic segregation is higher, but again, in the range that we observe for historically for immigrant groups in the United States. And blacks is coming down, but it's still quite high compared to other groups in the United States. Another measure is a degree of residential isolation. It's a related index of segregation. And this is the percentage owned group in the neighborhood of the average group member. So for blacks, it's the percentage black in the neighborhood of the average black person. And the neighborhood, using census information, is defined on the basis of tracts, which are small urban units of about 3,000 to 6,000 people. So you see that black isolation has dropped, but not quite as much as black segregation. It's slowly turning down. Hispanic segregation is actually trending up because because of mass migration, immigrants don't scatter randomly in a metropolitan area. They go to neighborhoods where other immigrants live, and that has slowly driven up the level of of Hispanic isolation within neighborhoods. And they're actually, blacks and Hispanics are actually converging at this point. Asians have gone up, but are still in the moderate range. American Indians are not segregated really at all. This corresponds to kind of a new reality in American race relations. In the early 1960s, white Americans believed in segregation in principle. The large majority supported segregation of schools, segregation of transportation, believed that whites should get first chance at a job before black people. They would never vote for a black candidate, and so on. That changed after the Civil Rights era, and Americans abandoned racism in principle. However, if you look at the public opinion data, attitudinal data, that doesn't mean they're comfortable with African Americans. And they remain very reluctant to share intimate social spaces with African Americans. So schools, neighborhoods, marriages, families, these people have a limited tolerance, white Americans continue to have a limited tolerance for contact with African Americans. This comes from a national survey, the General Social Survey, in which people were asked to give the racial composition of their ideal neighborhood. So if they could choose the neighborhood they wanted to live in, what would they live in? Whites would choose an overwhelmingly white neighborhood. This is the average of all white respondents. African Americans, although they have some preference for a black neighborhood, have quite a considerable tolerance and interest in living with other groups. And if you were to break this down into tolerances, which one would you live in, even if it's not your preferred composition, the percentage for whites and other groups rises dramatically for African Americans. You notice here that the average, on average, whites would tolerate a neighborhood of about 17% black. And when you look at those declines that I put up earlier, you find that they're really structured by the percentage black. Places with small black populations are actually declining fairly rapidly. But the higher the black percentage in the metropolitan area, the less the decline. And for the above, the 17% and above, it's more like those hyper-segregated cities. And all those hyper-segregated cities have large black populations. So we're really bifurcating in the United States. Places with small black populations, especially in the West and parts of the South, are actually desegregating at a rapid pace. But the large black communities, New York, Detroit, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Chicago, Newark, are not desegregating. They're remaining stuck at a very high level of segregation. Nonetheless, in the year 2000, we observed for the very first time in American history, at least since we've been looking at census data on income, that there emerged a class differential for segregation among African Americans. So if you look at 1970 data, 1980 data, 1990 data, and you plot the degree of black-white segregation by income, the line would be flat, straight across. It wouldn't go down. Finally, by the year 2000, that class differential emerges. As income rises, black segregation falls, still right on the border of the high range, and much higher than other groups. In fact, the most affluent African Americans are about as segregated as the very poorest Asians and Hispanics. But nonetheless, class has come to play a role in patterns of segregation where it didn't before the turn of the century. So segregation is still very much with us. There's been some differentiation across metropolitan areas. Some have desegregated. The places where most African Americans live have not desegregated. And one of the things I'm interested in addition to the causes of segregation and the reasons why it persists at these high levels, one of the things I'm interested in is the consequence. What are the consequences of segregation in the United States? And as Elizabeth said, what I want to focus on today is one of the consequences of segregation, and that is the role that it played in structuring the U.S. foreclosure crisis. What we found when we did the analysis, and I'll tell you what we found first and then go back and explain how we found it and what's happening, what explains why this happened. We found that segregation, black segregation, is the strongest single predictor of the rate and number of foreclosures across metropolitan areas. And this is holding constant the effects of a variety of other factors, the degree of housing price inflation that occurred in the metro area, the degree to which metro area had subprime lending, the average credit worthiness of people who were taking out loans during that time in metropolitan areas, the degree of land use regulation, and the coverage under the Community Reinvestment Act, which basically it was a federal law that outlaws redlining and requires banks to make an affirmative effort to loan in historically underserved areas. So even controlling for all these things, segregation stands out as a as the biggest predictor. So to get at this finding, we basically estimated a model of foreclosures where F is the total number or the log of the total number of foreclosures per house, or is the log of the total number of foreclosures or the rate of foreclosures. The log of both. Alpha is the intercept, S is the vector of segregation measures, and Z are a set of control variables, and of course an error term. These are the variables we use. This is the analysis we did. So we predict the number of, this is predicting the total number, the log of the total number of foreclosures, using different indices of segregation, controlling for all this stuff, and you see that segregation has a fairly whopping effect in driving the number of foreclosures. Whether you measure segregation using the similarity index, the 0 to 100 measure of the degree of residential evenness or unevenness, or the isolation index, the degree to which African Americans are isolated in all black neighborhoods. Asians are not very segregated. To the degree that they are, it actually reduces foreclosure. The thing about segregation is that it concentrates the characteristics of the segregated group. So for blacks, because they have much higher rates of poverty than other groups in the United States, when you segregate African Americans, you concentrate poverty geographically, and you create pools of disadvantaged people. Asians actually have higher incomes and lower rates of poverty than white Americans. So when you concentrate Asians spatially, you create pools, geographic pools of advantage, which are not susceptible to predatory lending. And the control variables work mainly as one might expect. This looks at the rate, log of the rate of foreclosure in a metropolitan area. Again, segregation of African Americans stands out. It's a very robust effect. We tried all kinds of things to get rid of it, and nothing that we threw in the model could get rid of it at all. And just to show the power, we looked at effective one standard deviation increase in segregation measures and other things that are typically thrown out as underlying causes of the foreclosure crisis. So one standard deviation increase in black-white dissimilarity increases the number of foreclosures by 15,000 and the foreclosure rate by 1.68 percentage points. This is much bigger. These are much bigger effects than the housing starts ratio to measure overbuilding, the degree of land use regulation, the ratio of post to pre. This is what's HPI, housing.
House price index.
House price index, right. So this is the price inflation, subprime loan share, NSA credit score, change in unemployment rate. all these things are not nearly as big as the effect of segregation. And before we did this model, the entire foreclosure crisis was being attributed to these sets of variables. So what's the causal mechanism here? How does segregation produce large numbers and high rates of foreclosure? Well, it really has to do with the changing nature of discrimination in the United States, which was caused principally by the advent of mortgage-backed securities. Mortgage-backed securities came into existence in the 1980s and became common in the 1990s and dominated the mortgage industry in the 1990s and 2000s. A mortgage-backed security, well, before mortgage-backed securities, banks made home loans, like on It's a Wonderful Life, you know, the building and loan, and they get a loan, and then you pay back the bank, and the bank knows the borrower, and the borrower knows the bank. After the advent of mortgage-backed securities, increasingly loans are not originated by banks. They're originated by mortgage brokers. And brokers basically go out and originate mortgages, get people to sign the contract to make the loan, then they take these mortgages and they sell them to another party, a bank or a securities firm. The bank or the securities firm then packages these loans into a security, combining them according to their risk into different tranches, risk tranches. In theory, this will balance out high risk with low risk and help you control risk. And then you sell these mortgage-backed securities to bondholders, to investors. So now, before mortgages, the number of mortgages made were limited by the amount of the deposits that a bank had on hand to lend. After mortgage-backed securities, there is no natural constraint on the number of mortgages. The only real constraint was what the bond market would bear, the number of mortgage-backed securities that people would be willing to buy. And the binding constraint then becomes the number of mortgages that can be generated. And creditworthiness is not seen as a major issue because subprime loans actually carry higher interest rates and can be combined with conventional loans to manage risk and actually produce a higher yield bond if you want to. And it creates a hugely profitable cycle. Mortgage brokers generate loans, they immediately sell them to a securities firm divides them up into risk tranches, then they repackage the loans from different tranches into bonds that are sold to investors. Rating agencies who are paid by the banks who produce these securities give the bonds AAA rating and believe the risk is controlled by diversification. And if they don't believe that, it doesn't matter because if they don't give it a AAA, the bond issuer will take his business elsewhere. So they have a conflict of interest. All these actors make money while assuming no risk. Brokers, securities firm, rating agencies, and even investors could manage their risk by entering into credit default swaps. So they could actually take out an insurance policy that, bet that if a set of mortgage bonds went into default, the insuring agent would pay them. So basically, all along the line, people are hedging. This set off an intense search for borrowers because the more people you get loans, the more you could repackage them and sell them as bonds to investors. And in this context, formerly excluded clients like poor African Americans became extremely attractive. Racial segregation of poor minorities created a natural market for subprime lending by bringing about geographic concentrations of financially unsophisticated and historically underserved minority homeowners. And black neighborhoods were easily targeted for subprime lending by unscrupulous brokers. The brokers could make a lot of money not only by selling the loans, but by disproportionately marketing subprime loans to African Americans who were unused to financial products, had historically been underserved. Many lived in neighborhoods without any banks. And these neighborhoods were blanketed with leaflets. hit with robocalls, door-to-door salesmen looking for people to take out loans. And many African American families who actually own their homes outright were marketed a subprime home equity loan. And so basically the wealth, their housing wealth was stripped away from them in the end. This story wasn't being told by anyone at the time it was happening. As things started to break and the crisis bubble burst, the whole cycle was all predicated on rising housing prices. And when housing price rises stalled, then the whole thing started to cascade and fall apart. And then people started taking a look. Only two people I know of really were on top of this story from the very beginning. One was Gretchen Mortensen, who is the financial columnist for the financial section of the New York Times. The other was Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone magazine. I've been a subscriber to Rolling Stone since 1970. And I can tell you that they are way more on top of political reporting, financial reporting, than any other major magazine in the country, including Time, Newsweek, The Economist, all of them. And this is from a quote. I'm going to quote now from Matt Taibbi. This is in this week's Rolling Stone. It just came out. And he's describing the mortgage crisis. What the article is really about are these rocket dockets, they're called. They're these courts that are running through tens of thousands of foreclosures per day that have been robo-signed and are fairly fraudulent. Anyway, here he's just talking a little bit about the background. All that changed about a decade ago thanks to the invention of new financial instruments that magically turned all these mortgages into high-grade investments. Now, when you took out a mortgage, your original lender, which might well have been a big mortgage mill like Countrywide or New Century, immediately sold off their loan to big banks like Deutsche and Goldman and J.P. Morgan. The banks then dumped hundreds of thousands of home loans at a time into tax-exempt real estate trusts, where the loans were diced up into securities, examined and graded by the ratings agencies, and sold off to big pension funds and other institutional suckers. Since these mortgage-backed securities paid much higher returns than other AAA investments like treasury notes or corporate bonds, the banks had no trouble attracting investors, foreign and domestic, from pension funds to insurance companies to trade unions. The demand was so great, in fact, that they often sold mortgages they didn't even have yet, prompting big warehouse lenders like Countrywide and New Century to rush out into the world to find more warm bodies to lend to. In their extreme haste to get thousands and thousands of mortgages they could resell to the banks, the lenders committed an astonishing variety of fraud, from falsifying income statements to making grossly inflated appraisals to misrepresenting properties to home buyers. Most crucially, they gave tons and tons of credit to people who probably didn't deserve it. And why not? These fly-by-night mortgage companies weren't going to hold on to these loans, not even for 10 minutes. They were issuing this credit specifically to sell the loans off to big banks right away in furtherance of the larger scheme to dump fraudulent AAA-rated mortgage-backed securities on investors. If you had a pulse, they had a house to sell you. That pretty much sums up what was going on at the height of the boom, and why suddenly African-American neighborhoods, low-income African neighborhoods, were ideal targets for marketing of subprime loans. Segregation then created a natural market for, not simply for mortgage lending, but for subprime mortgage lending. Controlling for individual and neighborhood characteristics, the rate of subprime lending was significantly greater to blacks and Hispanics and to people living in black and Hispanic neighborhoods. From 1993 to 2000, the share of subprime mortgages in minority neighborhoods went from 2 to 18%, 7 years. Minorities were significantly more likely to receive unfavorable terms on their mortgages, with prepayment penalties, high cost ratios, larger rate spreads. And the degree of subprime lending, the differential between whites and blacks, and the extent of subprime lending holds regardless of income level. Because in the past, segregation has only recently begun declining by class, so affluent blacks live in segregated places too. And they're in places that historically have been underserved by financial areas. And compared to a white person of the same income, they're much less financially sophisticated. So racial differential in the degree of subprime lending is strongly correlated with the level of segregation. but it's actually uncorrelated with the rate or number of foreclosures. And this yields an ideal instrument to control for endogeneity and confirm the kind of causal relationship between segregation and foreclosures. So we estimate S, an instrument for segregation, based on the differential in subprime lending between blacks and whites. And it's actually more, this is actually done from a refined a differential that controls for a variety of factors using a logit model, Probit model. And so we control for things like creditworthiness and all that stuff. You just look at the pure racial differential in subprime lending, and then that predicts our instrument for segregation, which we then include in the second stage of the analysis. And oh, there it is. Estimate race diff from Probit models. And so we're controlling for type of loan, amount of loan, borrower income, whether it's a first or second lien, whether it's owner, investor, or owner occupied, type of loan purchase, median tract income, tract to MSA income ratio, ratio of single family units to the population within the tract, and the tract minority percentage. All those things are controlled, and the differential between whites and blacks is what's left. And when we run the two-stage least squares, lo and behold, this is the ordinary least squares, and the indirect variable here. It not only persists, it actually gets a little stronger. It's not a significant shift, but it's certainly evidence of the strength of this association and provides some assurance, some support for the idea that this is a real strong causal effect. Segregation really is a structural feature that's causing the foreclosure crisis in the United States to be much greater than other countries that don't have segregated populations like we do. So the conclusion is that racial segregation was an important contributing cause of the U.S. foreclosure crisis. The effect of segregation is independent of other economic causes of the crisis, and the explanatory power exceeds that of other factors hitherto identified as key causes, such as overbuilding, excessive subprime lending, house price inflation, and the low credit worthiness of borrowers. Neither the number nor the rate of, moreover, neither the number or the rate nor the rate of foreclosures is in any way related to expanded lending to minority homeowners under the Community Reinvestment Act, which is often fingered by conservative groups and banking industry lobbyists, fingered as the reason for the subprime mortgage crisis. Just to, as Elizabeth said, we put out a press release on this when it came out, and it hit the papers, hit the wire services, and here's a sample of 2 of the emails I received from concerned public citizens. Who, of course, hadn't read the study. They were just reading the results from the press, and I keep the original spelling. So how much did Barney Frank, Maxine Waters, Pres Obama, and the rest of the Black Caucus pay you for that one-sided report? Being a white man like yourself and having a white son who was drugged through the ringer to buy his house in 2005, I was infuriated when I found out that minorities are buying the same value homes without proving income. What do you say to stuff like that? The point is not that the same scheme didn't run on whites. Millions and millions of whites got victimized by the same scheme. It's just that segregation created a special market niche that allowed blacks to be uniquely victimized and disproportionately victimized, and to make the housing crisis worse than it would have otherwise been, and worse in the United States than many other countries because of our high rates of segregation. So here's another one with the subject line, predatory lending or Jimmy Carter and Barney Frank. You got paid to do this study? The government set up this housing crisis. You and an increasing amount of Americans know this. Why does no one tell the truth about the story? Maybe it has something to do with your department receiving large amounts of government funding. I have a master's in engineering and thought also that social science must be treated in the methodologies of science as opposed to biased propaganda. if this is the kind of work, research, being done, then the people will reconsider the work. We true scientists have no need for garbage masked as science. I made the mistake of deleting one of the more profane words. I wish now that I had saved it. As you see, there's just a tremendous amount of misinformation out there about the mortgage crisis, even as it's playing out now in these rocket dockets and being covered by robo, which is filled with fraud from start to finish. It's got nothing to do with African Americans per se. African Americans were disproportionately victimized, but by no means were they the only victims in this whole mess. Millions of middle American homeowners and home buyers were sucked into the vortex and became victims, and we're now doing the most massive foreclosure in all of American history. By the tens of thousands every day, foreclosures are happening, and they're not really happening according to the letter of the law, the rule of the law. It's really a national scandal. But there's a lot of money being pumped into the blogosphere and the media to make people like my correspondents here think that it was black people that caused the mortgage crisis. So it's not people who were running the banks, not people who were signing AAA mortgages and stuff and it was junk, not people who were bundling together mortgages, half of which were probably worthless the day they were signed, not the people who were going out and mortgage brokers going out peddling these things irresponsibly and using misinformation and all kinds of illegal schemes, and not the kind who were systematically targeting African Americans for predatory loans against federal law. No, none of those people are to blame. It's poor black people. They caused this whole crisis. And that's probably the more common storyline that you get in the United States, which only goes to show that we may have elected an African American as president of the United States, but as the high levels of segregation show, and as the kind of reaction that I get for putting out a study like this indicates, we by no means become a race-blind society. So I think I've talked enough. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
Two related questions. What is known of the housing stock that are covered by these mortgages? Are these homes that people have been renting and now will buy? Are these new homes that have just been built for the purpose?
Both.
And who's making the money when the mortgage is released so that the bank is paying somebody that money? Who walked away with this money free?
The investors certainly get the money being paid for mortgage-backed securities.
No, I'm talking about the original. You know, I go buy a house and I get a loan from the bank, and that money I give to the seller.
If you buy a brand new house, you take out a mortgage, and the bank gives you the mortgage, and you give the money to the seller. Okay.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. Who's that seller?
The person who's selling the home. In black neighborhoods, it tended to be more home equity loans, but not exclusively home equity loans that were marketed. And so basically, they invented a scheme. You know, if you look at wealth levels, black wealth historically has been a tiny fraction of white wealth. Black incomes rose after the civil rights era, and they've come closer, but the gap between black and white income hasn't narrowed. Black-white wealth gap is huge, and it hasn't narrowed. In fact, after the crisis, it's gotten worse, because this turned out to be basically a mechanism to suck what little wealth there was out of black communities and transfer it into the pockets of people living in and around the Manhattan Island. But for other homeowners, builders would build on spec, set up, and this was very common in places like Las Vegas, around Phoenix, Arizona, various parts of the Florida housing market. They would just go out and open land and build all kinds of tract houses. Then they'd actually go find they found Latinos or poor whites to attract them to these homes with these terrific terms. They could move in right away and actually pay less than they were paying now. Of course, it was not a fixed rate loan and balloon payments and all this other stuff that people weren't aware of. And then the people who got in on the act were the home developers, because they would put up this home and then they'd, boom, get a big payoff because somebody would buy it right away. So the whole cycle was being fueled. So it happened in both ways. Both the home builders, developers made a lot of money by marketing these things. Many of them have gone under now, but that's how they were making the money then. And people originating and packaging and servicing the loans were all making money. Yeah.
So, although you just touched on the black-white wealth gap, there has been stuff done in sociology saying that African Americans have made some sort of progress in terms of, making, class-based gains. And one of the things that's pointed to is rates of black home ownership and this rise of black suburbs and a black middle class. To what extent do you think a lot of those claims or sort of nice findings are going to have to be rolled back in light of all this?
They already are. You follow the data, they're already rolled back. The gains in white and black ownership and black wealth have basically disappeared. And they were not that spectacular to begin with. Like I said, we control for community reinvestment act coverage, but when you look at the number of mortgages originated by institutions covered by the CRA, it's minuscule. The big action was all these private actors making the money. And they actually, because it was convenient, they bought in to the line of, well, we're increasing minority homeownership, we're doing good. And it became like a selling point, even though in the end it ended up sucking wealth out of the black community.
I'm wondering about why there wasn't more flow of information from the neighborhood level up into the financial system. Like I happened to be working in affordable housing in New York in 2005, 2006, and I heard a presentation on the securitization of subprime mortgages from a neighborhood development and financial literacy group that was doing work in these neighborhoods and could see at that moment that this was crazy. And how did that, if the awareness was there at that level, how did that not trickle up into the financial system? That's a big question.
Basically, small NGOs running voluntary attendance enlightening sessions are no match for big financial institutions with lots of money to sell, to take out advertising, to do robocalling, to advertise and basically market these things. So there's a marketing juggernaut compared to a couple NGOs out there trying to raise awareness. It just was not an even fight. And in the aftermath, they've uncovered emails from the president of Countrywide Lending, where he admits these things are all totally toxic. I mean, they knew exactly what they were doing. I guess they thought that if you throw something up hard enough, it'll never come down. But of course, eventually it did come down, and so did Countrywide. Basically, we bailed out. We didn't bail out Countrywide; it went under. But we gave Wells Fargo, taxpayers gave Wells Fargo the money to be able to buy Countrywide and handle all those debts. So taxpayers ended up fronting a lot of the cost of this.
Sorry, is it possible to go back to the conclusion slide? I don't know if that's easy enough to do. Okay, so the bit I don't understand, this is probably a really obvious question, so please point out if it is. I'm certainly no engineer, as that critic said, so I'm not going to be able to criticise your maths. But to me, I'm having trouble establishing the causation as to why the fact that black communities are segregated would increase the overall impact of the number of mortgage foreclosures that there were. I can understand how it would spatially concentrate the impact, but assuming that the black community weren't segregated at all, but had the same income distribution, surely they would have been sold the same subprime mortgages. Surely they should have.
They're harder to find and harder to market to. It makes for extremely convenient marketing. You just go to a black neighborhood and you go door to door.
Okay.
And for robocalls, you use telephone exchanges to cover black neighborhoods.
Okay.
And you use black zip codes to tailor to do the mass propaganda. So you get lots more bang for the buck from poor blacks for any African American because they're all concentrated in one place. So the highest mortgage foreclosure rates all the attention goes to places like Phoenix and these places in Florida and whatnot. But if you go to inner city America, you see tragedy people being displaced from their homes, losing homes that they paid for 20 years ago, all kinds of and that's hardly getting any attention in the press. So, I mean, that's basically what happened. Yeah.
Could you go to the next slide with the quotes from the correspondence?
My friends?
Okay, so for the grace of God, I could be the guy in the second paragraph. You know, I'm an old white guy. I've got a master's in engineering. I've even got an MBA. But when I absolutely agree with your findings and, you know, believe what you're doing. But when I look at all the numbers and the formulas and the pages of, you know, I start glazing over, even though I suppose if I really studied them, I could understand it. So the political action question from me is, now that you've done the study, how do you get the right parties to understand it and do something about it and act on it?
Well, again, it's kind of an uneven playing field because the big banks are pushing their line to distract attention. I read Matt Taibbi, read all of Matt Taibbi because he's really been following this for a long time. But read the current issue of Rolling Stone. His rocket dockets are like hidden; they're not public. Unlike most court proceedings, they're not in open court. They're hidden off. In theory, they're public, but in practice, they're not. And the judge whose court he visited, actually threatened a lawyer with contempt of court for bringing a reporter into the courtroom. So there's a lot of resources being put in to save the situation for the financial institutions that are really at risk here and push the pain off onto poor homeowners. And poor homeowners are being portrayed, well, they're deadbeats. They didn't pay. What don't you understand about, reneging on a loan? That kind of thing. Rather than focusing on all the fraud, all the manipulation, all the misinformation that was put out by the financial institutions themselves. So it's just really, it's very tough to break through.
I mean, do you have a personal plan, or do you have some other people to work with that can get to the right people in Congress, if there are any right people in Congress?
We've been talking to people. The good thing about a place like the Wilson School is that we put out a press release. The imprimatur of the Wilson School carries weight, and it attracts attention. So attorneys general from around the country wrote and asked for copies of the article, and reporters from around the country talked to me. Controller of the U.S. Treasury contacted us. People from the U.S. Department of Treasury contacted us. Congressional committees contacted us to get information. So I'm trying to do what I can. And all that. But it's really tough to break through. Len Rex on the show, Phil Entertainment, he cries and he's all upset. I'm sure he's drawn. I haven't watched him back, but I'm willing to bet that he's got one of those chalk diagrams with CRA up here, black people here, putting down the foreclosure crisis down here.
Probably wrote an email.
I can't compete with that. I do my best, but and Jake's been talking to. Who'd you talk to last week?
Yeah, so we talked to somebody on the TARP Oversight Board, a colleague of Elizabeth Warren, Richard Neiman, who's the superintendent of banks of New York. He was very interested, and we went to a conference in Cleveland, which actually has these resources like you talked about in New York, and they're finally breaking through. A place like Phoenix doesn't have that. They're going to suffer a lot more for it. And then tomorrow in Temple University, we're going to talk about it at their symposium on discrimination. It's co-sponsored with the Pennsylvania Commission on Human Rights, so they're taking it very seriously there.
So, we're trying to get the word out there and do what we can.
Yeah.
Incidentally, Mr. Scientist here, this was an email, right? So I emailed them back and said, well, I share your concern about, by the way, I'm a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Here's the study. I'd appreciate any comments you have on the flawed methodologies you might have used. And of course, I didn't hear back from them.
I have a couple of questions on methodology, actually. The first one is, in your comments, I find it confusing, because the first part of the presentation was about segregation. The whole idea of mortgages is you give mortgages to three types of people. The people who buy new homes, people who buy existing homes, and then people who are taking these home equity loans. And I think that, generally speaking, we assume that most of the people that are getting mortgages are people that are buying new homes, and that mortgages
Portion of loans going to home equity
Pardon?
rose dramatically.
But that's what I'm asking you. So, is there any data? Can you enlighten us in this particular case of the Afro-Americans about the shares? Because if a lot of it went to new housing, then there's an issue here about whether new housing is also segregated, or whether the new housing is simply.
New housing tends to be less segregated on average. We know that.
And is there any data at all about the breakdown of these foreclosures, and how much of it was from home equity loan, and how much
Probably
of it?
do that. We haven't done it. Can we do that, Joe?
Yeah,
Okay.
and some other people have done it, yeah.
And do you have any idea what?
I think it's disproportionately refinanced. That's my understanding. I know subprime lending was disproportionately refinanced. It was majority refinanced.
Right. So
Majority home equity.
I think that's an important part of the story. If
Yeah.
because then it
Okay.
fits in with your segregation thesis. That basically you get a community with a lot of people that are already
Right.
there, and then you continue to screw them by giving them subprime loans. So it's really not
Not new houses.
real. It's not
For
real.
blacks, it's not new houses. The whites got screwed with the new houses, and Hispanics to a lesser extent got screwed.
Right,
with
so
the
I think that's an important part of the story. The second one, which is really a methodological question, in none of your tables you use income as a control variable. And I don't understand why that is the case. Because income is probably a major
We have
determinant
median
of
household income.
You have median household income.
Yeah.
where?
It's buried in the middle. But median household income, along with,
In the control variable.
yeah.
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
No, that's totally fine, there's a lot there.
Okay.
Let's see, anybody else who hasn't had a chance yet? Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm an environmental engineer, so I design water and wastewater treatment systems. And but I'm originally from Boston, and so when it comes to like water quality, I can tell the difference between I turn a faucet on in Boston and I turn one in Philly, where I presently live, and I realized that based on the difference between water quality is because I think the politicians who lobby or request for the federal funding of the Clean Water Act, when they build those treatment plants in those cities, depending on who the politicians are, they get a certain amount of funding. Like the tunnel in Boston, they got that money because the senators were more powerful to get the money. So I just think, like, going back to, somebody made a comment about awareness. Yeah, about awareness. Why weren't there political representatives or mayors or senators in those communities to tell them, okay, this is what's currently going on, prepare yourselves or be aware, and why certain communities that are more awareness,
Well, I don't think there were certain communities that were more aware than others. At least I'm not aware of any. The knowledge was the press wasn't covering it. Some NGOs were kind of digging down and figuring out what was going on. But it was a big party, and everybody was making money. And the mayor of Las Vegas, loved this stuff. And they thought that, you don't want to be a party pooper. The party was, people were making money hand over fist. Las Vegas was the most rapidly growing city in the country. And the housing boom was driving the economy. So a mayor is, whose term maybe lasts another 2 years, is not going to get up there and say, this whole thing's going to collapse. It's going to be a Cassandra. That's not where the politics were at that time. So, if they have a real interest, especially a financial interest in believing a falsehood, people can come to believe with all their might. Yeah.
So this might be a little bit beyond the scope of the study here, but I'm curious if you've been thinking about this or can suggest some sources. What is happening, this is very macro, but what's happening at the micro level in the neighborhoods? Where are people going? And if we know that foreclosures, one foreclosure in a block can lead to more foreclosures, and if these are concentrated in neighborhoods that are already struggling with stability, what are the kind of long-term neighborhood impacts that we should expect to be seeing?
That's a great
Yes.
PhD thesis right there. Or a
My
master's.
master's students.
You're exactly right. That's the obvious next question, because these things, the foreclosures, you can see it on maps, they are concentrated in space. And that means that economic havoc is being wreaked on disproportionately on certain parts of the urban environment. And then who knows what's happening to the people that are actually getting evicted from foreclosed houses. They're probably going to families or shelters. I mean, but that's also not being covered. That's not part of the story right now. So it should be. So any students want to do a dissertation with me on the effects, the consequences of foreclosure in black neighborhoods, you know, there's a great topic right there. Jake's got enough for about 3 or 4 dissertations going on right now. So.
And he started as an MPA student and then became a PhD student. He talked to
He got snookered into the PhD program. He came here to get an MPA, and look what happened to him.
Sorry, I wanted to sort of invert that actually, and rather than going down to the micro, almost expand to the international level. In terms of solutions and where you would, what you would lobby governments do on the basis of your research, I assume that there's going to need to be some sort of extra regulation in terms of mortgage lending. And so I was wondering how much you take the next step. I mean, you were talking about people who foresaw this crisis, but you were looking really at the mortgage crisis specifically. There are people like Nuriel Rabini and people working, I think he writes for the New York Times, saying that the global trade imbalances are what's generating low interest rates in America, and that's why there was such a market for these rubbish AAA products in the first place. I mean, how much can you kind of, without destroying the purpose of the study, expand it into the international level?
Well, this is where I wish I had my colleague Paul Krugman right here and say, Paul, take it away. I don't, you know, there's lots of villains in what's been happening over the past 30 or 40 years. This is just the latest episode in asset stripping in the United States. And part of it is our own unwillingness to face up to our own structural economic problems in this country. Nonetheless, this particular scheme could have been prevented by regulators actually paying attention to what was going on. One structural problem is regulators tend to be lawyers, and all this stuff is done by arcane, basically financial engineers who are working fairly advanced algorithms and mathematical models, and the lawyers don't, you know, they're always playing catch up and they don't understand this stuff. So you should be putting financial engineers into the regulatory branches to follow this stuff.
So this guy, he's got a degree in engineering.
Yeah, it could be an employment opportunity for him. Alternatively, he could just tackle Barney Frank on the way to the Capitol Center. I was going to say one other thing. Oh, well, also, in this case, a driver that drove the process in the United States uniquely compared to other places was because it was the racially disproportionate marketing of subprime loans, which is a violation of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So civil rights enforcement is also part of the solution. Would have helped the program. And then finally, a big factor in the meltdown was the existence of something called naked credit default swaps. Everybody knows what those are, right? Naked credit default swaps are basically contracts that allow you to take insurance out on an asset where you don't even have an interest. That's why it's naked. So, like a house insurance, I can't take out fire insurance on my neighbor's house. That's not allowed. because then I acquire an interest in smoking close to his bushes. But that's allowed in the securities industry, naked credit default swaps. So that's what brought down Bear Stearns, basically. Everybody took out credit default swaps on Bear Stearns, and then the same people who had these contracts basically issued loan call all at once. And it crashed, and then they all got paid off. And AIG took the heat then. It was the person, it was the company that was issuing all the credit default swaps. But all this stuff is real complicated. And it's much easier for Joe Sixpack to say it's the Community Reinvestment Act, and black people's, and then there are interests out there that are propagandizing that, pushing that as in talking points that are issued out of think tanks. But the thing that scares me is virtually all of the abuses that brought this on have not been corrected in the regulatory legislation that's passed. Credit default swaps being exhibit number one.
There's a book out called Meltdown, which is a compilation of articles from The Nation magazine. And in one of the chapters in the book, it claims that while there was a large effort to have laws against predatory lending practices, that it was defeated in every state except North Carolina, and North Carolina had a much lower foreclosure. So one of the questions, the mortgage underwriters were actively engaged in trying to defeat any regulation
Sure.
that could prohibit some of this stuff.
Sure. There's the amount of money spent on lobbying by the financial industry is because they couldn't make this kind of money if they were really regulated in the public interest. So naturally, they spent a lot of money to prevent being regulated in the public interest. And Barney Frank, I don't know why they're blaming Barney Frank, because he waves his hands a lot about protecting consumers, but he does the bidding of his Wall Street constituency, who pumped tons of money into his Senate campaign funds, and so he is a guy to blame, but not for the reasons they think. They think that he gave too much away to African Americans, and that's his problem. But he's really been doing Wall Street's bidding, at least in my reading of the situation. Yeah.
So I guess my question would be, you definitely focused a lot on blaming, well, not blaming, but pointing the finger, I guess, is saying that the banks had a role in this. But do you feel as though there was some political player? I have to think as far as when we talk about segregated neighborhoods, most of these are in majority minority districts. So was there no one, I don't agree with this first person, but I'm saying, like, in the CBC who was like, hold up, what's happening in my district? It's great that there's home ownership, but let's look at this a little bit deeper, or are we just going to tout the fact that black home ownership is up?
They mainly touted the fact that black home ownership was up, and all this was flying under the radar. A lot of people just thought that this was, these were new vehicles, and they bought the line that these mortgage-backed securities controlled risk. There's no risk, and they're rated AAA. So people believed it's not just uneducated inner city dwellers, pension funds, mutual funds, union funds put lots of money into these things. Sophisticated people put money into these things because they're all rated AAA, and they were practically zero risk, and they were paying good rates of interest. And so it was really kind of under the radar, and the nasty shenanigans were not known and not being brought out and not being covered, except the pages of Rolling Stone. But I dare say that most members of the congressional delegation in Washington don't regularly read Rolling Stone, although they probably should.
We got the McChrystal thing.
Yeah. Rolling Stone is actually in an era when newspapers are collapsing all over the place, cutting back their investigative teams, and cutting back their foreign bureaus. Rolling Stone's actually, expanding its investigative work and doing more.
So thinking about sort of tracing out this causal process more, you could probably have Jake do this because he seems to have a lot of time on his hands. You could consider maybe the case of the Cuban
He's
enclave.
fastest general, so he's home free.
Oh, yeah, you got time. You consider the case of maybe the Cuban enclave in Miami. So I haven't read your colleague Alex Portes' work in a while, but the logic is that in an enclave economy, there are these community institutions that are actually able to compete with outside institutions. So potentially there are these community banks that can provide lending that are competing with these big lending companies. And so you actually have a highly segregated area that's still close to the It's a Wonderful Life model of lending. And so it could potentially be the case then that there's less of this predatory practice going on, and as a result there are fewer foreclosures and a lower foreclosure rate. So it could be the exception that proves the rule and helps trace out this causal process even more strongly.
Possibly, but enclave economies are really tricky things to create. And the Cuban enclave economy in Miami is really almost a unique entity. Everybody talks about the Cuban enclave, and while there are neighborhoods that are overwhelmingly Cuban, probably a majority of Cubans don't live in them. It's actually, the levels of segregation are nowhere near as high as African Americans. And so the enclave economy actually is doing business with a lot of people outside the enclave. But one of the, and this is where we should have my colleague Alex Portes here, the enclave economy basically got started building on relations of enforceable trust. And so that is more like the It's a Wonderful Life, where you actually know people, and they were in the early days, Cubans would make reputational loans to each other based on ties that they established back in Havana, and they're all from an elite class. Remember, it wasn't a working class
I
migration.
used to live in Miami, so yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So, we go to drink now.
Yes, we can.
Thank you.